April the 10th, 2014, in the Lima Park Architecture District Board of Directors. Roll call, Director Bernstein.
Present.
Director Carpenter.
Present.
Director Powers.
Present.
Director Solano.
Here.
And President Ines is here. Public comment number 1. Having none, we'll go right into the study session. Okay? And I believe that includes you.
Yes, I'm Les White. I'll be presenting the first part of the report, and then Susan will be discussing portions of it, the collaboration between the two of us. I had explained to the board the working relationship that I was going to have with Susan in preparing the report because of her rather unique knowledge. So with that, we'll try to keep this to about 45 minutes for our talking, and then I think as we go through each major section, if you want to ask questions, that way you can, and if you want to hold some of them to the end, that works too. You need to be flexible, feel flexible in that regard.
And I just need to add to that, just to underscore the fact that this is a study session of the board. It's not a regular meeting. And so we're not asking you to take any formal action tonight. This is more a chance for you to discuss and then give broad direction if you so choose it again.
And more specifically, you can't take that.
That's correct.
Right, we say recommendations at the end, and that's for you to consider at a subsequent meeting. The process that we utilized here was involving the board in terms of filling out questionnaires and the chief. I interviewed all the board members and the chief. We included 2 interim chiefs that had been there before, along with the interim administrative services director, Susan Interview. And that was largely just filling out questionnaires. I did not interview them. I had a request from a former board member to interview that person, and I said no, because then I didn't know where I would stop in terms of interviewing former board members. So I took the information that I had from the questionnaires. I made a summary of the responses on those questionnaires. I also went back and reviewed some of the things I had written in 2008, 2009. And there were some similarities there as it relates to goals that I'll mention in a moment. We looked at some best practices. Whether the board considers those best practices, we'll find out. They're best practices that I've seen with other nonprofit boards and with city councils in the past, and with city managers as well. Reviewed the scope of the presentation with the board president, the vice president, and the chief, and it was determined there that we would cover goals, roles, and relationships. So that's why you see in the packet some of the appendix items that speak to some issues regarding committees and other factors. So we agreed that we'd recommend a core set of goals and areas of improvement. We've already mentioned the sources for the goals were board member and chief questionnaires, the board strategic plan, our input, as well as, and I mentioned it later on, your 2014 goals. Now, we developed for our own, from our own standpoint, some criteria for setting priorities. This is something that the board might want to consider. You may want to alter because you may not find these to be the criteria that you would think would be important. A number of these, I think both Susan and I have used and seen in other organizations. So when we were looking at what goals to establish, we said, what's been the prior board direction? And major emphasis for us was anything that strengthened organizational capacity. Frankly, I saw some really interesting goals from board members, but until this organization has the capacity to deliver on those, then you've got to focus, we think, on learning how to walk before you run. And that's why the goals that we have, the 5 goals Susan will cover, are really fundamental kinds of goals. Now, those particular goals of labor management, core fiscal practices, relationships with other agencies, all popped up in 2008, 2009. And I think when it comes to fiscal practices, you've made some headway there. You've made some headway with relationships with some of the other agencies. There is an area involving, in our opinion, an area that can be further strengthened is the way that communication occurs between the chief and the board and the chief. I think that could be improved, and we have some suggestions for that. So in any organization, I think, when you establish goals, you kind of develop some priorities, and that was our cut of those. We even considered the frequency of responses. I mean, one of the areas that was frequently mentioned by this board was the need to resolve labor management issues. That, of course, existed in 2008, 2009. You're making some headway on that. That continues to be a goal now. We considered the responses and general observations too of the interim chiefs and administrative services director. So those are incorporated in our information as well. Then, as I said, we considered the 2014 board goals document, and in theirs there was a repeated reference to fiscal health, labor relations, internal and external communications, capital improvements, and then strategic plan goals and priorities. Says, yes.
I have a question. On the general observations of mayor, chiefs, administrators, did you use the same questions that you asked us as board
Yes.
members? The same questions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Then, as I said, there was some 2014 board goals that we included, which were the fiscal, the fact that you needed to get some goals adopted, and most of you were saying, that needs to be limited and doable goals, and then clean up the labor management. You'll notice I said there are other important goals, and I thought they were really good ones. There were some on innovations in the fire service that I thought were good, cert management and training, long-range planning. But again, I think those are ones that you might look at 3 or 4 months from now after you have done the core goals that Susan will speak to now.
So, in setting the top 5 goals, we kind of laid out some what we're calling the key principles. And I won't read them all to you, but as Les mentioned, one of the ones that we think is really important is that we need to build some organizational capacity. I can tell you, having been here for about 8 months, that there's just right now not enough horsepower to pick up very many more items, much less to continue to do the day-to-day stuff and to do it well. So capacity is definitely an issue. We took a look at your standing calendar that's in your work policy manual, and I think that it represents a really good skeleton to which we can add. We should incorporate work plan items and key dates for the accomplishment of those work plan items into that standing calendar so that we can be moving towards something that a lot of you said in the meeting, which was like a 6-month look at upcoming agenda items. So we've really done a job with that kind of planning. we think, and feel very strongly, that we need to carefully manage how new projects are added to the work plan units, so that there's some discipline within the organization, meaning that your board sets the goals and the work plan for the chief to carry out with the staff, and that it's not just randomly altered every time the board meets or every time a director has a great idea about a new venture for the organization. That there needs to be a process for modifying the work plan and for incorporating those new ideas to the extent that they can be. Les mentioned the issue about communications, and so one of our key principles was that there needs to be regular and effective communications from the chief to the board and the other way as well. We need to be talking to each other. We also felt that one of the key principles was that you can only do so much, so that you should have a limited number of essential building block goals to work from. And they should cover the fundamental activities of the organization, and they should be aimed at building capacity. This is something we talked about before and doing the strategic plan, but we do recommend that any goals and projects that you come up with are integrated into the annual budget process. And in this case, we're talking about the 2014-15 fiscal year, which starts in less than 3 months, in which the budget for which you will start to review within the next month. A basic principle that holds for pretty much every body of this type is that the board needs to set the priorities and the policy, and the chief then needs to be able to manage to those with minimal interaction from the board. And basically that's just don't micromanage. Tell him what you want him to do and then hold him to that. We need to be able to, and that's through the evaluation process, and we should do that on a regular basis. Number 8 really just means we need to clearly state, here's where we are as an organization, here's what we need to do to improve the organization, and once we've done that, then we need to hold people accountable for accomplishing the changes that are proposed. We need to make sure that the goals and the work plan projects are achievable, that we have resources, that they are doable. There's some very good ideas out there that may not be achievable at this point in time. And then finally, we believe that it was understood that chief's return to work was in part premised upon improving the work processes and the organization itself. Any questions on those? If not, the next 2 slides really just summarize the 5 goals. I'm not going to go through them because we're going to talk about them each in a little bit more detail, but essentially our recommended 5 goals, and I should stress these are not in any order, so number 1 doesn't mean it's the highest priority goal. We consider all 5 of them to be equally important. Employee relations. Second is organizational structure. That's the one that actually deals with organizational capacity. Organizational accountability, fiscal management, and then board and chief relationships and communications. So let's dive into goal number 1, and again, feel free to ask questions as you go. Yes.
So Susan, do you think that it makes sense for us to prioritize the 5? I mean, I kind of felt like when I was reading this that it was not because of the things that were put together, but the feedback that we had gotten from each of us. There was a lot of mishmash of things that there was probably some overlapping of things where the board shouldn't be involved in, from a strategic public policy standpoint, right? I mean, if you look at what the board, the fundamental question is, what should a board be doing, right? And so I think that the 5 goals are good, but I don't want us for us to continue getting into a mishmash of things with, like if you think about goal number 4, fiscal management. I mean, I know that I put that in there, but it's not reflected in it. It's always been one of my goals, for example. And I think that for any governing board, that should be the main goal, because that's really what the community expects, right? And so I'm just wondering if it makes sense for us to prioritize these 5 and focus on that in priority order, so that we're not losing sight of the public policy viewpoint versus, an operational viewpoint.
And I really think that that's entirely up to the board to decide. Les and I didn't try to assign a particular priority or weight to one or the other, but I think that you as the 5 policymakers can certainly have that discussion, and it's not inappropriate, it would not be inappropriate for you to give me some priority.
I mean, maybe this is the time, I don't know. I just think that before we dive into each one, we need to set the
Honestly,
time.
part of my reaction when I looked at the 5 goals was that if the board limits it to the 5 goal areas, that's doable.
It's a lot still.
But it's doable. I mean,
Yes.
that an organization this size should be able to do these things. They're not all going to happen tomorrow, but over the course of a reasonable period of time, there should be real progress on these. And the board should expect and see that certain things are happening within the organization to improve it without having to get in and do it. Versus, like on a budget, you actually take a formal action and adopt it. But you need to know that all of those things are moving. You need to know them because that's part of the work
Right.
that the chief and his staff need to do. And if you don't see a snapshot of the whole picture, then you're going to see part of it, and you might think, wow, there's a lot of capacity there that can go and do a bunch of other things, but they need to build capacity, in our opinion, first, in order to achieve some of the very lofty, excellent goals that I saw in the 2014 piece, that they wouldn't be able to do.
Right, you got the foundation, I get
Without the
that.
foundation.
I get that, but I just feel like,
Well, that's your call on, if you think you need to set priorities on those. I'm a kind of manager. When I look at something like this, I'd say those are 5 reasonable priorities that can be addressed by this organization over the next several months.
no, I agree. I'm just saying,
So you
among the
want-
5,
yeah,
how do we, what's our, what should, from a board, a governing board that deals with public policy, what should the number 1 be?
Okay.
Right, and I agree with the 5, I'm not saying I don't
No,
agree.
I
I
understand.
would just offer an alternate view. I think that what they've outlined for us is that these are 5 must-do things for this year. Yeah, it's not what's first or second, third. These are all 5 things we have to do. And I think when we prioritize them, we set ourselves up for maybe doing 1 or 2 and ignoring 3, 4, or 5.
I disagree, because like
No, well,
because for fiscal management, we're in pretty good fiscal health. So yes, that's the number 1. We kind of have that kind of taken care of, right? And so that's check on with our.
I don't know that. I don't agree with that. I mean, I just
Okay.
read a memo from Susan that we were getting next Tuesday, which raises a lot of questions about that.
No, that's cool. But again, then it goes back to these 5. I mean, yeah, we do them, but 5 would prioritize those, make them before number 1. And we'll get through all of them. I think you're right, they're doable, Wes. I just feel like we had so many different directions that we don't have our top priorities of the 5 goals.
I kind of agree with Peter that these are the 5 things that we need to do.
I'm not saying it's not, they're not.
No, I understand that, but I think we can go through the way Les has and go to goal 1. And I'd like to say with the revision of the draft policies and procedures that the chief's taken on with the employees and rewriting that, and the personnel policies, since we have an excellent HR manager now, that we're like 60% there, I feel, that we're actually on track relative to that. I kind of think development communication will improve these internal communications. The chief is working on that, but I think with some of the way we have some of these committees set up, and the president and vice president meet with the chief, I think a lot of that decision or information format should be shared a lot more with the general board than just the 2 individuals within there. And I think that can be worked on, but like I said, 60-70% of this, the chief's already gone forward with going number 1. Now, I would like to do 2, 3, 4, 5, like that too, and then maybe, just like what Virginia has said, maybe time to make a staff recommendation as to what we want once and 5. But Peter's absolutely right on. These are some particular areas that need to be.
I'm not saying
So that's
not,
my-
I'm not saying they're not the areas that need to be addressed, so.
And just something that you all need to keep in mind too is that, once you decide if these are your goals, or if there's some other set of things that comprise your goals, they need to be translated into an actual work plan that has, specific tasks in it and assignment dates, and those are the things you're going to be holding the chief accountable to in the next fiscal year. So, Director Solano just, spoke to another of the subpoints under the employee relations goal, which doesn't need to be called employee relations. It could be labor management relations. That's just a buzzword that we put on. In any event, there's a whole layer of detailed work underneath what you're talking about today that will need to be accomplished, so that you really have a feeling for what the magnitude of the full workload is.
And you need to see that, a simplified version of a work plan that says, here are the things that we're doing, assignments and due dates, and, that she should check in periodically with the board and just update you on that. Without getting into, detail of each one in great detail. But you need to see the overall scope of work so that you know what's going on. And what you want to get done fits into what you've already said should be done, as well as things that the chief has previously directed.
I just don't want to leave off some of it. I don't want us to not get through anyway. I'm fine with the 5 goals. I just think that better clarity, better direction, better prioritizing the 5. But if no one else wants to do it, if we should just dive into it. I just think, again, the question is, what should a governing board, what should a governing board be doing?
Well, maybe it would be useful just to keep talking about the 5 goals and the suggested work projects that we've included to get kind of a better feeling for how much there is there and where things really pop out as priorities. But I just want to echo what Gus said, that these 5 goals and the work projects that we've identified seem to us to be something that's manageable and that the district, through the chief and the staff, can accomplish within now and the end of the next fiscal year. And most likely you can take on additional stuff too as you start getting some of these under your belt.
Right.
So under employee relations, or however you want to describe this, labor relations, labor management relations, the bottom line is that this really should be a goal of the organization. I think most of you, if not all of you, implied that this was a high priority for you as individual directors. And that is that we need to improve and strengthen the relationship with our employees and build rationality, predictability, and accountability for day-to-day operations. And those things have been lacking. And with an improved relationship, I think that they will be accomplishable. That's a word. Some specific projects that need to be tackled, we need a new agreement with over 2,400. I think that's a given. At least it is to us. We need to complete the policies and procedures that Director Solomon referred to earlier. At this point, in the chief's report for next week's meeting, you'll see that we're talking about the project continuing on through June at this point, but we are still making progress as each day goes by. The general personnel policies, Jan's got her plate full with things that need to be formalized, rationalized, modified, whatever you want to call it, brand new policies put into place. There is a real lack of formal written policies to be able to point to that support any particular decision that's made. I can tell you this personally on a day-to-day basis. That's done it that way always, or that's the way Michelle told us to do it, or, but that's not how we should do business. And then again, Les is going to talk more about internal communications, so I won't go into that, but the communications deals not only with you and the chief, but with the chief and his employees as well, so that's a part of this first goal. The second goal, unless there's more comment on that one, has to do with the organizational structure. And again, this is really where we're talking about getting some key positions filled, getting the organizational structure that the chief shared with the board in February fully implemented, and the key positions that we see are the administrative services manager, so a permanent replacement for the position I've been acting in. The deputy chief position, that's really critical in the view of Les and myself. The fire marshal position, which will be on your board agenda for next week in terms of setting the salary for that, and which the HR manager is ready to start recruiting for once that's done. And then finally, the 4th Battalion chief, which is linked to the USAR program coordinator position, that was part of what the chief addressed in February when he brought his org chart to you. But we need to get those courses on board so that we're up to a really good capacity level in terms of addressing some of the other overarching issues. And then the final thing that we see on this is that the issue of succession planning is something that the chief and the board have talked about for quite a while. The chief had initiated a succession planning process with an outside consultant just before his accident last year. And some of that work has continued, but we need to pick it up, get it going again, and moving it forward. And that includes not just the act of assessing your organization and strengths and how people within the organization might move forward, but it's training, and more training. It's improving the evaluation process, and those other ancillary things that are linked to succession planning. Roger.
On goal number 2, this is complete implementation of current succession planning. We felt that the chief's done a really good job in setting active battalion chiefs that are actually working in the roles of those positions. I saw that in the organizational chart that there weren't positions that maybe would be beneficial, like a safety officer position, or how do we interject those types of ideas to the chief so that HR can look into them, like boost the training budget so that we can send those senior officers like the National Fire Academy, some of these management, like Harvard has a school, Stanford has a school, where top public officials go 6 to 8 weeks, and they go to these training things, and then also too is with the safety officer. Are we going to rely on an in-house person that we're going to give all the certifications to, or are we going to rely on a contractor to come in and provide those services to us? I think it's more of a cost-effectiveness aspect.
Right.
But things like that, I'm interested in. I know we keep flip-flopping with this hazmat group that's supposed to be responding for the entire county, and I know the chief said it's not really cost-effective for us to have our own hazmat group, but I think we need to look into that because the unstableness of San Mateo County with these consolidation of all these different fires, either districts or fire departments, they're going to take the same, it's going to fall in the same importance as it did in the past. So, are we going to have to carry the time for those things? And those are some questions that I have as a board. I don't want to tell the chief organizationally or operationally how to run his group, but these are just some of the concerns that I have with succession planning, career development within the organization, so that they'll get, if they want to go back to school, there'll be a certain amount of money for training available to them. You know, so I don't want to be a micromanager, but I want the chief to have the flexibility and the discretion to kind of come forward.
So, I'm sorry, but this is exactly.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
This is exactly what my concern was, is that I agree that with Rob, that those are things that probably need to be done to fulfill whatever the board's vision is, but that doesn't define the vision. Do you see what I'm saying? That's getting into the weeds, in my opinion. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, but, you know, where does that fit into the public policy piece of this?
Well, so I'll respond to this. First of all, neither one of you are off base. I mean, you know, Rob raised some interesting questions that you like the answers to, and you obviously are, you know, trying to focus the discussion at kind of the policy level rather than the implementation level. But as members of the board, and you know, the fiduciary responsibility we all have, and you have a right to ask those questions. And we're going to talk a little bit later today about the issue of specific requests for information and requests for additional undertakings of the staff and how to assess what impact that has on operations. So Director Solano, I'd say that some of those very questions that you ask are things that should come up when you discuss the annual budget starting within the next 30 days, because you're going to be going through the budget, looking at training, and you have some suggestions too about how you should be approaching the budget and a few other important issues. So there may be things that one director would like the chief and his staff to explore, but they may not receive the support of the majority of the board. And in that case, we probably aren't going to be able to respond to that question. So, but that's going to be something that this board as a policy body is going to decide.
Under fiscal management,
Well,
right?
it's
the budget or whatever.
It's under accountability, too, or
Right.
it's accountability. So,
When you look at a work plan and it has a bunch of projects in there, then I know from reading your 2014 goals that each of you had some areas that you were interested in. The fact that you have 5 board members that are interested in those things doesn't mean you're going to get them unless you dialogue about them and determine how those priorities stack up with whatever you decide are some core goals in the very near term. But the kinds of questions you're raising, I'm sure questions that will come up in a different form from other board members about doing some other things. And then it's a matter of judging just how much can get done. And I would say not a whole hell of a lot until you fill key positions here and get some structural things in place. Yeah, but there'll be opportunities then to move to the next step. I mean, when I looked at, Board Member Bernstein had some long-range planning items in there that I thought were really thought-provoking. But if you put those on this organization right now, they wouldn't go anyplace, primarily because this organization doesn't have the capacity to move them in place. But that doesn't alter the fact that those aren't good ideas, and that they can be considered in due course, and hopefully, as Susan said, due course being in 3 or 4 months as you've made some progress on basic areas.
And then you want to have that staff in place to be decision maker relative to the organization too, and bring your resources and talents in to assist the chief against long-range goals and objectives. So it totally does make sense that you bring that staff on first.
Chief needs to have a good, solid, fully staffed team supporting him in order to run the district to succeed.
I want to add just one quick comment on deputy chief. I think that's a really critical position for someone who can oversee operations, because this isn't like a city fire department. This chief is more like a CEO working with a board. And in that regard, much more has to be done in terms of board relations and communications, and then communications with the staff below. So I think that position can allow certain things to happen that are positive.
So goal 3 is organizational accountability. And this really has to do with what you're starting to do tonight, which is to talk about what the board's goals and objectives are for the district, and then how are you going to hold the organization accountable for ensuring that they are accomplished. So the work plan projects here, number 1 is to develop the work plan for the upcoming year based on what you decide your goals are and what specific things you want to accomplish within those goals. And this is where you would assign clear, really expected target dates for their completion, and where the chief would be assigning these various work project items to various members of his staff. And that would become a really critical document that you would use to evaluate the chief, and that he in turn would use to evaluate the folks who report to him. You need to link the work plan to the budget. Somehow right now, if you look at your current year's adopted budget, there's no discussion anywhere about performance expectations or linkages between funds and service delivery or the accomplishment of extra projects or outside tasks. And that really needs to happen really within a pretty short period of time.
Can you be just more specific about what you mean? You'd like to see measures there or something?
I think you can start at a simpler level than that. That right now, other than just having an organization that responds to fires and medical emergencies and does the other things that it does, there's absolutely no feeling for what in the budget is supporting any special undertaking. So you can start just by including your work plan projects within the budget, because some of them will cost you money, and you'll link them to the budget that way, and you'll be able to start measuring whether or not you're accomplishing the things you thought you were going to accomplish. You can eventually get to something like performance measures, and there's a million of them for fire departments. We have to reinvent the wheel on that. We just have to make sure that we can measure them and report them.
Are you talking about, I still don't understand that, are you talking about creating a line item in the budget for a project, for example?
No, I'm talking about within, and I did in the budget document, unfortunately, but I'm talking about within what is currently tabbed as the expenditure section of the budget. There are a number of programs, and within each of those programs, you can include a narrative section that talks about what additional responsibilities have been assigned to each program in terms of any of these special projects, and if there is a financial implication beyond just the use of staff time, then that could be tied in as well. And if the budget needs a one-time infusion of funds to accomplish a certain project, then that would be so noted, and you know what you're spending money on.
So it would be in the narrative part, not the financial part.
That's right. I mentioned earlier the standing items that you have that are Appendix F to the Policy Procedures Manual, and I would see you incorporating those items into the work plan. And you may recall that there are things like the lead abatement, the annual lead abatement process, and all of the various components of the budget, including the post and budget adjustment process. And I think there's about 31 different items in it. So it would be good to pull the relevant ones out and incorporate them into the work plan so that we all have the same understanding of what's happening and when it's happening. That will help you to figure out when something's going to be ready to come back through committee, if it comes to the full board, so you're not overloading yourself in any particular moment. And then finally, we think you should incorporate other key ongoing projects, and we had in mind here specifically that the capital projects should be incorporated into your work plan because they are a major component of the work that you're doing. As you become a little bit more in depth on this, you probably would want to incorporate key maintenance projects as well, those kinds of things. We don't do any of that right now in the existing budget document. Any questions on that?
I just want to make a brief comment based on what Susan just described. I've been in a lot of cities where the councils and in nonprofits where the boards didn't know what was going on because nobody was telling them the full picture. And the full picture usually amounts to the items that you've got in that standing calendar, a lot of administrative projects, some of your big capital projects, and then there are individual referrals from board members and council members that turn into projects. So you need to see all of those, and that's just part of the work on top of the fact that they're still out there doing fire prevention inspections and putting out fires and all of that. So it begins to give you, if you pull it all together under goal 3 that Susan described, you begin to get a real picture of what's going on.
These are other suggestions that we have for goal 3. We think that there need to be regular reports to the board that report on the progress of the various work project items that are defined and approved. We think that it needs to be quarterly for the first year, and we could probably get it down semi-annually after that. But that again, that would be up to the board. However often you feel you need to update, and we can discuss that with the chief and see if we can accommodate. As I mentioned before, you would use this as a significant part of whatever performance evaluations you do with the chief, and that he would in turn use it to evaluate his measures. This should be used as a foundation for monitoring new project requests. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later on, but essentially what we're talking about here is that at any given board meeting or even in between board meetings, directors, one director, more than one director, might get what he or she thinks is a great idea for a project that needs to be undertaken, whether it's a research project, so that we can decide whether we want to modify our training program, something like that. And we think that this board needs to come up with a formal way to deal with those things so that individual board members have a clear idea of what gets thumbs up or thumbs down in terms of being added to the work plan, and that you all have an ongoing way of modifying the work plan if your priorities should change in midstream. And we'll talk more about that later on. I did develop a draft policy for referrals and requests for information that was included as one of the attachments to the packet. I want to talk about that later we can, if not, it was just food for thought. But I do think we both think we need something like this, and thus mentioned best practices. This is a best practice in most agencies, most public agencies do have a formal referral request for information process so that board members can get things incorporated into the work plan based on the consensus of the full board. Helps the chief manage the organization, and it makes clear what the board's expectations are of the chief. We firmly believe, and I firmly believe, that we need to streamline the committee structure. I just, in the months that I've been here, I'll just be really frank, I haven't seen a lot of value added from the committees I've seen, and it's not really clear to me from reading the policy manual exactly what the charge of the committees is. I mean, there's some words in there, but I'm not sure what the board really thinks that means, and I think that that's a good discussion for this board to have at some point. We would like to suggest that you maybe think about, while you're working on perhaps a revised board policy manual having to do with the committees, something that a little food for thought, not something we can decide today, but that we hope we'll talk about at some future meeting, is perhaps putting the committee structure kind of on hold for some period of time and diverting staff time and resources, and there is staff time and resources connected with having committees, to instead scheduling a monthly work session, study session like this one of the board. We pick out, maybe for a 6-month period, you pick out a series of really hot topics that you want to delve into in more depth. And the staff puts its time into developing whatever board capital is required for that, whatever research needs to be done. It will be a committee of the whole. You will all be hearing the same information at the same time. Your deliberations will involve all of you. If you're going to continue to videotape your sessions as we are right now, then those sessions will give the public some inkling of what the deliberative process was like, unlike with the committees where, even though they're open to the public, I don't think they're planning on televising those anytime soon. And frankly, the public very rarely shows up at those. So it's just food for thought. You might want to just put the committees out, park them for a while we're staffing up, and use the time instead to do a series of good, solid study sessions on key issues that the board is interested in learning more about.
Is today's meeting being televised?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Okay.
So the key issues, I'm not going to say I'm not open to that. I think there's definitely some value to restructuring the committee structure. But the key issues, I mean, again, I go back to, I don't want to have a little things and mishmash things, between what should be public policy and what should be operations. And that's what I'm afraid of for, we have a monthly study session. It's just, I'm not against it. I just think that it has to have some focus on what's going to be discussed and what a board should be discussing.
We would totally agree with you on that, that this would not be a free-for-all.
Right, but I've seen that happen in our board meetings, and that's what I want to avoid, because I don't want it to be like a monthly study session, and then we're having the same board meeting and have the same discussion, where it just becomes a 3-hour meeting, of the same thing, instead of what the board, I think, should be doing, looking at things at a higher level, on a policy level, as representatives of the committee.
Absolutely, we wouldn't disagree with you at all. And just as by way of example, there is an item on next week's agenda that has to do with my observations about your budget and studying financial practices. And the material that's in that would be, I think, really good as a subject for maybe even 2 study sessions of the board, because there's a lot of policy issues that the board needs to become more facile with dealing with first, and then once you're at that level, start to make some decisions about. So I think there's plenty of subject material that is at the policy level.
That's where I think we need to focus on, instead of, because we have a tendency to get down into the things where we really shouldn't be getting into, in my opinion.
We agree.
Well, I think it's an excellent idea, Susan, where the monthly sessions, monthly study sessions, because what I've seen being on here for 2 years on the board is that the president assigns HR, finance, emergency preparedness, and when they meet, it goes on a consent agenda. And an example would be like for HR, let's say that Chuck and I aren't on the HR committee, but there could be some discussion that we want to add in this type of study session that we want to contribute. But if it's on a consent agenda, it's kind of like already presented, already written. And I think it's an excellent idea because we are all here individually elected. And we should be able to put in our 1/5 evaluation or review of particular items. And I'm sure the staff will prepare us on point as to what needs to be done for these study sessions. So
Well,
I think it's a great idea.
That would be
I
the
really
intention.
do.
So, now, and that's something we obviously aren't going to decide tonight, but we would urge you to consider it. And you might find that it actually works better for you in the long run than the committee format does. We have to tell you from our observation, the kind of the committee structure that you have, the number of committees that you have for the size board that you have, it's a lot.
But again, I contribute that to not being focused on what should a board be doing, right?
Well, but then the committees are made up of board members, so you can argue
Yeah.
that whatever the committees do and the board, full board does should be similar as it relates to the distinction between getting too far off into operations versus
Right.
talking policy areas.
That's not true though, if you're talking about inviting the public to.
What?
It's not true if you're talking about inviting the public to have a say about it as well. In other words, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that all 5 board members have to hear the public input on a particular item. If only 2 of the members hear it, that might be sufficient. And so I think there is some potential
Well,
savings.
certainly with regard to committees, there's a role, you can have a role for committees. I would say the other option to what Susan said is then you got to we would recommend strongly that you streamline your committees
That's what I'm
and have a very formal process that has public agendas, people notice that these meetings are occurring. I would question having a whole bunch of ad hoc committees that are virtually invisible. I mean, if transparency is important, and it should be in a public agency, then there's ways to improve that. So, I mean, what Susan was suggesting was, I think, a good point, and the one we agreed to, which would be put it on hiatus, study it, and see about how to restructure it. But also, you have assurance that when you have a study session, you all are on a level playing field then. And that's really positive. And you're getting a lot of good information on subjects.
I would just like to add an observation in it. Susan has, I think, been very gentle in talking about the drain on staff time, the committee structure and so forth, and I think that's very real. I just want to give another side of it, unfortunately probably not as gently as Susan does, but I'll tell you, I've been concerned, and I think it's worth studying the committee structure for many of the same reasons, but I feel like it's a terrible drain on my time, and that what the staff feels that they need to do is show and tell. They trot out all this stuff to show me, none of which I care about or matter or part of my job, and I go away and I feel like I've given my time to the staff for not much value for anybody. So again, I'm not being critical of the staff here, but I think everybody's a little uncomfortable about what exactly are we doing here and what's the purpose of this. And so I do think it's worth discussing.
No, and that, I haven't looked closely at that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, a little bit of historical perspective. I guess Rex and I are the only people that are around from the genesis of the committee structure, which happened when Bart Spencer was board president. And at the time, it was hoped that by having certain things dealt with by committees, that the board meetings would be somewhat more expeditious. I think there's a great value in doing things which are somewhat symbolic, and saying, we are now going to engage in, we're going to do things differently, we're going to behave as a board differently, etc. And I would pick up on your suggestion of having a hiatus on the committees, and I take it even further. I would suggest that we, as we review the policy manual, we in fact remove the committees. But the quid pro quo for that was that the board should be prepared when necessary to meet more often as a board. So some months we might meet twice. And it would be totally driven by the workload. If we had more items that we could deal with in a reasonable period of time at the monthly meeting, we'd have another monthly meeting. I'm a little bit skeptical about study sessions because I think they do allow us to just sort of digress. And if the board meetings are always structured in terms of thinking about these 5 priorities, then we're constantly coming back to, okay, here are our 5 priorities, and we could even structure the board meetings somewhat along those lines. And so it keeps reminding us, okay, what about number 1, number 2, and then there would be an item 6, other, and there would be like the weed abatement thing, which would have to come in periodically. There would be other kinds of things that from time to time, contracts, etc., administrative functions. So I would use your suggestion of saying, let's change the way we do business. I'd take it somewhat further and say, okay, we're not going to have committees. We're going to have goal-oriented board meetings. And when the agenda for any one month gets too long, we'll have a second meeting.
I could live with that.
So because it is more focused, instead of, things being talked about that's
Well,
not even, that are not even what a board should be discussing. Do you see what I'm saying? I guess that's my big thing, is what should a board be discussing? And you're right, I think if we focus on having a goal-oriented meeting, that may actually fix the problem.
I think that's a great marriage of some of the benefits of a study session with the goals and your regular meetings, and then spending more time on substance like that. And then you have a consent calendar for the routine.
Like the treasurer's report, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's
The regular monthly stuff.
right.
And the other thing I would urge us to do is that one way of dealing constructively with the consent calendar is, and we started getting packets out earlier. I would just urge people, if you've got a question on the consent calendar, via the chief, ask the question, try to get it out of the way, so that fewer and fewer things need to be taken off the consent calendar.
Y'all have that discussion in the January meeting.
Well, not focus on the consent calendar. And since then, we still spend a lot of time taking things off the consent calendar, which I think if people had asked a simple question beforehand, we could have just simply dealt with the consent calendar as without exception.
That's what I do. There's a question I call it, Carol. What does this mean?
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're down to the last little point on this page. And basically we are suggesting that you schedule a board study session for next January of 2015 to undertake a detailed review of the goals in the 2014 board member goal package to see if at that point it's a reasonable time for us to add additional items to the mix of things that you want to see accomplished in that fiscal year. That's just, you could do it earlier than that, but we thought that that would give the chief time to get staffed up, to get staff oriented, to start working on some of the other items that we've mentioned tonight before you put more on his plate.
Also, too, Susan, we're kind of a unique situation with Task Force 3 because we're dealing with different budget deadlines relative to the federal government. I think it's October 1. The state's July 1st, and we're July 1st, July 1st. So we have some of those deadline issues. I don't know how to, if we're doing January, actually January really doesn't start any budget process
We picked
Or you
January
can do a
for two
semi-annual.
reasons. Number one, it's, obviously it's mid-year during the fiscal year. But it's also a point at which this board really needs to start thinking about what its goals and priorities are gonna be for the next fiscal year. I mean,
Okay.
the staff's already in the weeds, starting the budget process by late December or January.
Okay. Well, that's fine, it's just that we have a little bit different mandates that other agencies don't have, because they don't have to deal with
But
that.
that brings up an interesting question. We talk about setting board goals for 1 year. Do we need to set them for 1 year, or do we just say that we want to set these board goals and we're working on those? These are the priorities and we want to finish those, whether it takes us a year or 6 months or whatever. And when we're done, we'll go back and look at what was lower on our priority list and move it up.
Well, I think, and that's a really good point, Mr. President. And I think that really the way to look at the goals is not that they are for a fixed period, but that they are, it's kind of a moving target, basically. And that's why you build in regular reviews, because as things change, circumstances change, or as you start to accomplish some of the main subpoints under each goal, you may in fact want to add new goals, or you may have goals that last you for 2 or 3 years, depending on the nature of what it is you're trying to accomplish.
The way, along the lines of what Susan said, the way I've seen this structured is that when you get a progress report, you're seeing goals that are completed, or projects under goals that are completed. Those can drop off after you see them, and then there's capacity to do some other things. So it's moving. It's always,
Moving target.
if it's not moving, then that's problematic.
I would also add a slight twist on this. I think that January session could well be a session in which we do not just simply goal assessment and goals setting. Well, in one part, we're evaluating how well we've done with our goals in the last year, and the second part, we're evaluating, or saying what our goals are going to be for the next year. That's a wonderful umbrella, but one of the pieces of that I'd like to emphasize is I think that the board should in fact engage in a performance review of itself, and actually grade ourselves on our performance, and encourage the public to participate in that discussion if they like. Now, my hopes are not up. This room will be crammed with people. But I do think that it is an important message to the people that we serve that we will in fact hold ourselves accountable, and we would welcome them participating in that process.
I think I have in my files a board assessment process that I could share. There you go.
Goal 4 has to do with fiscal management, and this goal, it really recognizes the fact that you are healthy, the district is healthy from a financial management standpoint. We want to maintain that health, but what this goal really has to do is to try to improve the usability, the clarity, use the word transparency of the district's various documents, whether it's the budget document or whatever monthly reports come out. And as indicated, there is in your packet, I've handed out to everybody, I think, but Director Bernstein, a copy of the report that I wrote for next week's agenda that has to do with my observations about the process and how I think it can be improved. And it ranges all over the board, from our actual fund structure to the format of the budget, to how you dedicate your reserves, to how you classify fund balances, and to starting to do some 5-year forecasting, and which we don't do right now, and to actually adopting some formal financial management policies. So that's what this is all about, and I hope that the piece that you'll talk about at next week's council meeting will provide some kind of a jumping off place for the specific work plan items that are included with this slide.
I was really challenged to understand your budget. I was looking at it and having a hard time tracking numbers and what the numbers relate to. And that's meant to be constructive, because I have a hunch that several years ago, it wasn't nearly as good as it is now. So you're moving in the right direction, but you've got a ways to move.
I guess one of the things I worry about, when you talk about staff time and budget, what we call chart of accounts in the business world, which is how you set up your budget. When it comes to things like chart of accounts, when it comes to things like personnel policies, I really worry if we're relying enough on other people who've already solved the problem. You know, do we have to create a chart of accounts for a fire district which is unique? Are there not really good chart of accounts out there that we could just simply adopt and say, hey, that's what we're going to use as our chart of accounts? And similarly, in the personnel business, there must be thousands of agencies like ours across the country and hundreds across California. Is it really a good use of staff time to have every single one of those agencies writing every paragraph of every personnel policy?
We don't. Sorry to weigh in, but,
No, but
when it comes to the personnel policies, like for example, we've purchased Lexipol, which many agencies have taken, and you have to make it your own, if you will, but it provides that framework that you're talking about. And I think what Les and Susan are getting at is that our budget looks like no other budget that every other sort of public agency out there has. So these suggestions sort of mirror, because when I started here, I too could not figure out our budget.
Let me back up.
Okay.
You talked about Lexipol, but earlier in the discussion, the comment was made, we don't really have personnel policies. Now, I'm confused here, because if we've got Lexipol, why don't have we personnel policy? What's the difference?
Well, we're working on the Lexipol policies, which are specifically relate to operational as well as sort of personnel policies for the safety personnel. What is unclear is that many of our policies, the prior policies that were in place prior to the implementation of the revised policies and procedures for safety personnel, it was unclear what the status of those policies were as they relate to non-safety personnel. Furthermore, some of the safety personnel policies don't have overlap to staff, if you will, and many of the policies have not been updated for years and years. For example, our ADA policy is not updated. There is no FMLA policy for all of the employees. There's one in the AFSCME MOU, and that's the only one that we have. So there's a lack of continuity in particular policies that apply to all, as well as a lack of policies as they relate to safety versus non-safety personnel. So that's what we're trying to remedy right now. That's the Lexipol policy process. And through that process, I'm working on uniform policies for staff, and those are best practices policies, not reinventing the wheel, as you said. I look to.
I think essentially what Jenny is basically agreeing with you.
Yeah.
That in point of fact, that we're not suggesting that we would reinvent the wheel. And in terms of our chart of accounts, some of what is in the piece that you're going to talk about next week are very simple changes that won't take the staff a lot of time and that do exist in other agencies, so we could just migrate them in.
Well, why make simple changes if what we're doing is putting Band-Aids on a budget that a lot of people don't understand? Why not say, okay, starting with next fiscal year, we're going to have a new chart of accounts?
Because you don't need a whole new chart of accounts.
Well, if you don't understand it, you know.
Well, and we're kind of getting into what we're going to talk about next Tuesday night, but the primary reason that people don't understand the district's budget is because a number of years ago, a decision was made to incorporate what we call internal service funds into the chart of accounts. And I'm here to tell you that they are not real internal service funds as far as how they're defined in GAAP or by the governmental accounting standards board. They really are shell internal service funds that were created, in my view, specifically to create I think I counted them, 15 different reserve accounts.
Well, as you mentioned, we're going to discuss
Right.
this on Tuesday.
So-
Just know that from my perspective, I will be arguing for going to a new chart of accounts.
Okay.
And if not in
and we'll be
2000,
ready to
if not in the
respond.
next fiscal year, the year after. Because just like changing the way that the board operates, I think taking a totally fresh look at the structure of the budget, could be very, the budget is an incredibly powerful tool for any organization. And if we don't understand it, and I don't have enough fingers to count the number of people who told me already they don't understand their budget. So if we don't understand it, let's say, fine, we don't understand it. Let's create a budget we understand and not be tied to the past.
I agree.
Because chances are, if we don't understand, or if the staff doesn't understand it, then how easily is the public going to understand it? And this budget really is for them too, right?
Well, of course it is. It's a public documentation. It's what represents.
Absolutely.
The budget is what allows you to accomplish the goals and objectives and basic service delivery expectations of the organization.
And your transmittal letter should tell a story.
And
It
they-
should be the best storytelling piece
Right.
in this organization.
Susan, I wanted to ask a question, and I don't want to be glib or dismiss anything, but let's just take number 4 for a moment as a goal. What I'm not clear on, and my comment relates really to a number of things here. If you just, let's say this were a regular meeting, we're voting, we said all in favor, and everyone votes, it's done. The board's done with it now. Why is this a board goal and not a staff goal? I guess I'm not, what's the board going to do about any one of these things here?
The board sets the goals that are for the organization.
But once we've set them, which
And-
is a 5-minute thing, then what else do we do? I'm looking for a work plan of what we do.
Well,
But the we of that is not just the board, it's the staff. So you need to know what the staff is doing
No, I
to,
don't.
yes, you do, in order to determine what you want to have done.
I want to have the structure tied to this camera. So I say yes. I don't need to know how they do it. I don't even have to understand. I'd like to understand it all, don't
Right.
misunderstand me. But as long as I know they're doing it, isn't
No,
that enough?
and I understand that part, but then a month from now, you might have another idea about fiscal area that you'd like to see done. So you've got to know that this is going on and that that's taking, a considerable amount of time of some of the fiscal management people.
Well, then I'd understand, again, I'm trying to speak.
No, I understand.
I'd understand if this is a plea for saying, we're up to our ears, don't leave us alone for 6 months. I mean, if that's what it is, then I'd like to understand that, but I'm just not sure. I look at these things and all these look good. There's no issue about it now, because there's one thing for me to do here except say yes.
and in fact, that's really true.
It is
I
true.
mean, that's exactly what we're looking to you for, thank you, is for you to say yes. And then what you're going to do with these, Director Bernstein, is you're going to use these various work projects, and you're going to look at the chief, and you're going to say,
Where
what
are
have you
you?
gotten done? And if he says, oh, I haven't gotten any of them done, then you're going to say, what the hell have you been doing, Harold?
But let me just add one more thing, though, and again, I don't mean to in any way have to be negative, because I was just trying to understand how
No,
this
no.
fits in
No,
to
no.
the whole thing.
Right.
And I understand what you're saying. We're up to our ears. We got so much stuff to do. Don't fill our plates with any more stuff right now. And again, I know you're saying it more gently than that. But one of the things that I'd like to do, for example, and I know that it fills the hearts of staff with terror, is I'd like to meet with some of my fellow board members and discuss some things we'd like to do as a board. And frankly, I don't care if the staff's there or not there, but I know they would be terribly fearful if they weren't there. I guess I'm suggesting maybe if this weren't quite such a control-oriented culture, that maybe we could actually meet and do some stuff that didn't involve the staff or staff time or inquiries. Anyway, just a thought.
There's that, no, there's always that possibility, but if it does involve, usually what I've seen is that what boards want to do and councils want to do does involve staff time. So for the board or council to be able to get what they want to get done, they need to know that certain things are being worked on and that there's only so much capacity there to do those things. On the other hand, if you're saying that there may be things that the board would like to do that takes no staff time, that's a different ballgame.
Well, I'm following up on Virginia's suggestion earlier. Let's just hypothesize for a moment that the board would like to meet and talk about visions for 5 or 10 years from now. And that may well be interesting to some staff people, but I don't think it requires any staff person there. It doesn't require any research. Maybe we can do those kinds of things.
It would be useful for staff to be there because they might be hearing some really good ideas. And, you know, it's not always, well, it's not always that staff is there to say, here's what you need to do. A lot of times board members have really good ideas, as evidenced in some of the goals that I saw. It's just a matter of, you know, what most of those that I saw are going to take staff analysis and help to get them done.
I don't agree with that. I think we could have a discussion without a staff report, for example.
Well, you could have a discussion, and you could decide conceptually, is that something you want to move on? Yes, you can do that. And then it's a question, after you say conceptually want to do it, how do we get it done?
Exactly.
And then that's where, I've seen that happen a lot in, you know, in strategic planning sessions, where boards and councils have good ideas like that. And then it's a matter of just, once the concept is out there, of figuring out how you're going to do it. And I guess all we're saying is that before you can figure out how to do some of those things, you've got to be able to walk.
Well, let me just say, here's my concern, and I'll drop it. In looking at some of these things, and I agree with them, these are not things that are going to be done in 3 months. Okay, so this could well be a year's kind of process, and I don't want to wait a year to get going on visioning. So,
no, I think that in terms of visioning, you know, if you're thinking about where can this district go 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what are some different concepts that are out there? I remember that you had some ideas in the goals. You had some ideas about, I think it was the congestion issue and how you address that. And those are good areas to be exploring.
Yeah, and I would say that in contrast to my earlier comment, I think Chuck's comment about sort of the longer term visioning, I think that might be a very suitable thing for a study session.
Yes. Oh,
but I wouldn't want to mix the here and now stuff with the future stuff. And so that might be a really nice way to say, okay, once or twice a year, we're going to just put all the current stuff aside, we're going to look 5 and 10 years ahead.
And what do we want?
If you had a chance, I don't know if you read that little paper that I had in here, the Tecker Associates, about boards and looking at proactively, looking at the future, spending time thinking about where you're going instead of where you are. But you're absolutely right on the money in terms of the board doing that.
Right, that goes back to my original comments.
Yeah,
Should
no,
the board be doing?
you're right.
Right, and maybe that is another study session. Actually, that's not a bad idea, Peter.
It's a good study
Because
session.
Absolutely, but I just feel like if we don't have vision, we don't have anything to latch on to.
let me just say though, I think they both have to happen, and I agree with Peter that they're not the same thing. Because, for example, and I'll bring back Rob's comment earlier about staff training. One of the things, if you're going to plan for 10, 15, 20 years down the road, staff training is an important part. So what kind of structure and incentive do we want to have for staff training? How does that fit into the contract that we want to get done now? And the worst thing we could do is do something right now to get a contract done, and then a year from now say, oh, we can't do that because we got a contract that says something else. So, okay. Anyway, let's keep on going. I apologize.
No, don't apologize.
And I won't go through all the rest of these projects. We're talking about
But we'll have a good discussion on Tuesday on this issue.
We've read these, and we're reading this on Tuesday.
Okay, goal 5, how has to do with communications, and I'm going to turn this back over to Les, but this is something that came up quite often in all of your comments. That is something that came up back in the 2009 timeframe. And I think communications and relationships between the board and the chief are always something that can be improved.
I'm going to give just a snapshot on this though, because you've all read the packet, haven't you?
Yes.
So I'm not going to go through that attachment E in detail. I'll just highlight a few points. The first part I had down there was fire chief communications with board and organization. So these are things, and they're kind of intermixed in spots, but a lot of these are what the chief needs to do. And I've talked to the chief about these, and he's doing some of them and starting some of them, and may not agree with some of them. And then that's a discussion that you may have to have, or the chief may have to ponder later on. But bi-weekly one-on-one with board members. I was saying that on a regular basis, the chief needs to pick up the phone every other week, call you. If he's got 2 or 3 items, mention them to you. Take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but you do it on a regular, proactive basis. It's kind of scheduled. It's there. The next thing is the monthly activity report. That's being done now. That's provided at your board meetings, and I was suggesting to the chief, provide that in between board meetings, and then at the board meeting, just do a verbal update, but try to space these so that there's some reasonably constant communication in a structured way, initiated by the chief, going on in the organization. Then I said, you know, if there's always the issue that boards and elected boards and elected councils don't want surprises. So the way you deal with that is you do email blast or phone calls to all the board members saying, you know, this is happening. And you're going to miss sometimes. I know that there were times as a city manager where I didn't get it out in time and I got chewed out. So that goes with the territory. You sometimes get chewed out. Policy for media and other public releases, your 5.10 is really pretty well written, I think. It's just a matter of adhering to that policy. And you're probably doing that in some respects, so I'm just reiterating that that's good. And it has a chain of command in effect in there about how you make releases about closed sessions and other items, either from the chief or the president or someone designated by the board. Chief station visits, currently the chief is doing, I said do a minimum of a couple a month. He's doing more than that now. I think that the key there is that it just needs to be done with all 7 stations and all 21 shifts. And I don't know how many of you already...
3 shifts. Only 21, that's a lot more.
Oh no, I know.
How many have been done? I was at 3 just in the last month.
Yeah. But that's in the last month. So you're making good progress on that. And I wanted to mention that. Then on board communications with chief and employees, we had down here the board liaisons. That was mainly a matter of board liaisons. The chief needs to keep the board liaisons informed of items of interest that he's involved in so that they're not blindsided, and vice versa. When board members are having meetings with other agencies, they need to make sure that the chief is aware of that and that you're all in sync on those. Committee and subcommittee meetings, we've already kind of discussed that one. I don't know that we need to go through that anymore. I will say this, that you have a lot of subcommittees, and even if you decide to not do what Susan and I were recommending as your first step, which is just put them on abeyance, I would really urge that you clean them up and have all of the Brown Act rules apply to the ad hoc committees and committees. And we've suggested that you could look at 3 different committee structures if you stay with a committee structure. On the next item, monthly board meetings and closed sessions, that's fine as is. There's nothing to add to that. Study sessions, we've already commented about the fact that it'd be nice to use more of those for the kind of discussion that you, Director Carpenter, and you, Director Bernstein, and you, Director Corrali, and you, Director Solano, all of you mentioned, different areas that lend themselves to that kind of a discussion.
Yeah, I would just interject once again. I would like the discipline of saying, we're going to use study sessions to deal with things in the future. Anything that's dealing with the here and now ought to be on the regular agenda. Because otherwise, I think we muck things up. If we're looking at the future, it's great to sit around and talk about it. But if it's a here and now thing, I think we need to put it in the context of these 5 goals and say which of these 5 goals is the issue we're dealing with.
No, you can very readily do that. Study sessions could be for just the futuristic things, and then you redo your agendas so that you have substantive items on there that relate to, like, the work plan.
I worry about
the
study
day-to-day
sessions
stuff.
becoming an excuse for not doing our homework.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
No,
I
right.
can see. And waste time, quite frankly.
They can.
Yeah, they can if you allow it.
Right.
But you're in control. The next item, let's see, visiting stations. Just saying on this one, it behooves the directors to work with the chief to visit stations and to have a reason for doing that. And it also, I think, is important that that the chief organize these at least a couple of times a year so that board members are familiar with operations. Because sometimes board members feel compelled to do it on an ad hoc basis because it isn't being organized in a particular fashion. So I know the chief, I think, is willing to look at that. Correct, Chief?
That's correct.
Yeah, and I mean, and Harold, what you did for me when I first got on was really good, because I didn't have that background, the operational background. So you were very open about it. And I wanted to visit the station, see. So I thought that was really good. Something that's a more modified.
Well, and the firefighters want you to see things through their eyes too.
Right. It was beneficial for everyone.
Sure.
Thanks.
Cool.
The next item is a common sense item. I'm not going to go into that personnel performance issues discussing with the chief. But the next item would be the referrals by individual board members. That's an area where we have written up a policy statement that gives some things that can be done there to make that a more logical process so that the whole board knows what's going on and that the board can assess some of these new things in relation to a work plan that has existing items in it, because ultimately some of those choices are going to get down to the board. And also, when it comes to major new projects being suggested, chiefs can run off and do a lot of things too, and they need to go back to the board if it's a big ticket item and get approval so that it is properly mixed in then with the work that's already been designated. So most of these things are two-way streets, almost two-way street on almost all of these communication items. That's what the result is.
I just wanted to ask a question, just to make sure I'm clear. Have you now put it into practice that you're responding to, let's say I have a question, that your response to me goes to the whole board? Is that, oh, you're not doing that? Oh, okay.
But we are suggesting that that is a very solid practice. It is a common practice in public agencies to do that so everybody's informed.
Well, I guess my question, why are you suggesting it to me? I mean, why not suggest it to the chief or something?
Well, we're just trying to have the whole board informed of different things that need to be done in the communications area. I've suggested a
Okay,
number of these things to the
okay,
chief.
because it's not something the board needs to vote on, something like that.
Well,
You can
there
clarify it in the
may be a
policy.
policy there that you will need to act on.
And we have a little bit of cleaning up to do from the Kennedy years. There was a time period when we had a director who we
Back
had
when you were
basically.
40?
Not JFK years.
We had a board member who we had to basically prohibit from interacting with the staff in the fire stations, et cetera. And there's some vestigial language in there that we could probably look at.
But to Director Bernson's point, so in the past, some board members have not wanted their communications with me to be given to the other board members because they felt as if that was a privileged discussion or if they brought up an issue. So my practice has been, unless you tell me you want it, like you recently sent me one of those and said, when you get the answer, send it out to everybody. The majority of the board members currently, and this is not that they said you don't do that, that's kind of been the practice that I've used, which is if you send me something, I'll send you back a reply. But I won't broadcast it to everybody. A lot of times I'll send it to the president just so the president's aware of what's going on.
Well, that's a good discussion to just have, because now we all know that when we ask you something, we should indicate whether we wish you to hold it in confidence or whether we would like you to share the reply.
Right.
So you don't have to guess.
Well, I think
that's-
it would be a good board discussion to know whether anything should be held in confidence. In other words, if you don't want,
Until they,
For now.
I'm not sure you should be able to ask confidential questions. It's a discussion.
Yeah.
Oh, I think you should.
well, I think
It has may
that,
have to do with the performance of a particular individual, and I wouldn't want to sort of advertise that publicly. And once it gets sent to all the board, recognize, folks, that's public
That
knowledge.
is public information.
no, a performance, a matter of performance like that should be held in confidence, I think. The chief then needs to act on it or explain why he's not going to act on it. I think that what's being suggested here is a good way to practice, do this on an interim basis until you actually have a referral policy in front of you that you can weigh and decide how and if you want to use that. But typically, other organizations, if something's going to take 2 or 3 or 4 hours to do and it starts to get substantive, and it's not just a routine question about what happened with that, at that fire, or what happened with this fire prevention inspection that occurred. Those are simple questions, routine questions that can be answered readily. But if it gets to be substantive, then a good practice is for that to go to the board. The board weighs it and says, yeah, okay, go ahead and take a look at that and get it done.
Yeah, looking at the clock and being mindful of that we're not making decisions here tonight.
Right.
Would it be appropriate on the forthcoming event portion of the Tuesday calendar at that time to discuss what we are going to do the balance of this year regarding board meetings and committee meetings?
Sure,
I
we
mean,
can.
it seems to fall within the scope of the agenda as published. And we could just simply say these meetings are going to take place and et cetera, et cetera. So,
That's fine.
Also, I'd like to, Les, on the other page there, I think Carol has done a really good job with the press releases, pre-preparing them for all of us to look at, so in case we're asked, because
Yeah.
there's been some times that we've been asked about things, and it's great to have them, because, it could be something like, it's just a good resource to have.
On the press, having those press releases.
Right.
And you
Especially the stuff on Task Force 3, I mean, that was really great to,
You need to understand that I've chided him a bit on that, that
Oh.
he spends too much time writing those personally and needs to probably delegate that to staff and have them frame more of this for him so that he's reviewing and not initiating. But that's a staffing issue and that's a training issue, but it's one that I think the chief and we've talked about, needs to focus on and get some help in that area.
Well, you know, when you look at an organization, unless, I mean, you had San Jose Police Department, and, you know, the chief had a staff of what, 9 or 10 people?
Right.
Within,
Right.
and, you know, not only that, but had police officers for just different areas and regions. You know,
I understand.
Harold's got 145,000 people in 4 communities to deal with, so, I mean,
He has to do more.
Yeah. Again, trying to get closure. As I look at the budget for next Tuesday, you have items here such as discussion of the budget, district budget process. You know, that would be the place in which we can talk about moving to a new chart of accounts, et cetera, I would
That's
anticipate.
very appropriate. That's-
And what are some of the other things that we talked about earlier in trying to make sure we get direction to staff out of the discussion we had?
Here's the wrap-up slide, things that your next steps that you need to do, they may not be doable next week. You know, at some point, you're going to have, if you like these goals, you need to adopt these or some other set of goals, then we will, meaning staff, will come back and with a refined work plan that includes, you know, tracking, format, deadlines, etc. The policies and procedures is very timely, as you know, the president just sent out a memo to all of you about it's time for the May review. And I guess we'd like to request that you refer all of these proposed potential policy changes to your ad hoc board policy manual committee, which I guess is Virginia and Rob.
Right, yeah, so I was gonna remind everyone the same thing, please get us your suggestions.
So
we have
that's
the
kind of
board
what, that's
president,
kind of
we got the board presidents, so Rex has provided.
so that would be appropriate to refer to that.
Again, trying to get closure, looking at the clock, I would ask that for the May agenda, the issue of goals be there, and the issue of a annual calendar of board actions be there, so that we can say these are the months in which we have to do, you know, the weed abatement is one thing, budget is another, board's evaluation of its performance, the chief's evaluation, etc. And those can even be related to defined goals in terms of how we're moving our ways through the year.
Well, I'd like to request also that attachment B be a subject for a study session that evening, before the meeting.
Before the May meeting.
Before the May meeting, yeah.
Which attachment, theirs or ours?
Attachment B, it's the goal statements. I'd like to be able to discuss these goal statements.
At these.
At a study session before the meeting. Yeah, you haven't done that yet as a
As a new board.
Unfortunately, Susan, how many hours do you have left?
I have 18 hours left.
Vapors.
Well, let me just raise a question with Dr. Bernstein. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, these goals that were put here were things which have then been synthesized into the recommendations here. And if what we're going to do at the board meeting is talk about the recommended goals, I don't see the purpose of a study session.
I'm trying to talk about different kinds of goals, resolution goals or something, as opposed to, actually, could I pass out something? It would just take a second, let me just pass it around. This is something that, my feeling is in looking at this, is that almost all of the stuff that we've got here, with very few exceptions, are really goals that relate to the staff, not to the board at all. And I'm very concerned. I wanted to do this back in December. I mean, I agree we don't have maybe enough organization capacity, but when are we going to talk about the pension plan, for example? And that's not here at all, and we can't do a contract. In my opinion, I'm telling you, I'm not voting for any contract without having had a full discussion of what we're doing about pension planning. So when are we going to do that? And I mean, I agree with 90% of the stuff's here. I think we could just say, yeah, okay, go. But most of the stuff, I think, is stuff we're asking Harold to do, or Harold indirectly to do. And I just think we ought to talk. There are some important issues in these goals, and maybe there are only 3 of them or 4 of them we'd like to pursue, but we got to have a discussion about them sometime.
Well, my response to that is that if you think something's really important like pensions, that what you should ask Rex to do is to put it on the agenda, rather than say, why are we discussing it? We are unique in terms of local agencies in that each member of this board has the authority to have an item put on the agenda. You don't have to get a second person to agree with you. Anybody can put an item on the agenda.
Well, let me just say, I know, back in December, I sent a request, can we have a study session where we talk about our goals? And he said, oh, we're going to do it in a special way, we're going to get it facilitated.
Well, it looks like we're doing it.
Well, no, we're not talking about the vision part, we're talking about a manual.
I think you're really convoluting vision and goals. And nothing in attachment B, as far as I'm concerned, has got anything to do with vision. Maybe 5% of those things are vision. The rest of them have all been things that I think Les and Susan have rolled into these five goals. Now, you have a concern about pensions, and I think it's great to have a discussion about that, particularly because I think it's important you understand that our degrees of freedom on that are almost 0.
Again, I disagree with that, but I think we have entirely all the freedom we want to have with it.
So if we have a study session that deals just with pensions,
Well, we could talk about pensions, we could talk about our financial model, and I know that's kind of being looked at a little bit, but the financial model, I think, is really a critical item right now.
I think these things ought to be just put on the agenda.
We've talked about the capital budget, what else, when are we going to be upgrading other stations, and maybe that's not very important right now, I don't know whether it is or not. And we seem to be doing these piecemeal things. I don't understand, for example, why periodically we have to put a little bit of money into the capital budget for Station 6. I mean, why don't we just have money in there? Why, I don't understand why we're doing it piecemeal like that. And it just seems like we could be, when are we going to talk about it? I know, I mean, I think those are big issues.
Chuck, if you want to talk about something, ask Rex to put it on the agenda. Don't sit here and imply that for some reason, issues that you want to talk about, we're not going to talk
You can
about.
put those on the board agenda, particularly if you're going to restructure the agenda and make those more thought-provoking and substantive, then those are the kinds of topics that could come up at those.
I will mention something. I think the CERT thing is kind of, in terms of the good volunteers in CERT, is kind of at a crisis level right now, frankly. We've got people who want to do something to get our community ready, and right now they're waiting for the district to move. And the district is a reflexive organization. It needs to be. It's sending people here and there, and the person that's in charge of that happens to be there right now. So meanwhile, the citizens sit and wait and wait. It's not a good thing to do. We ought to talk about, letting CERT go. Let the citizens take a charge of CERT and get the district out of it, or I don't know what the answer is. But having a guy that's in Alaska in charge of it isn't working. When are we going to discuss that? Now, those are things that are in the board goals. I thought we were discussing them back in February. And we did, here it is. We're going to be May the next time we can do anything here.
So if we're gonna look at things like some of those big things, maybe those are like the study session things we will talk about twice a year or whatever.
No, I don't mean, CERT is a day-to-day operational issue. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think that falls under Manny's area of responsibility. Got nothing to do with Frank. And if a director wants us to have a report from you and recommendations from you and a discussion by the board as to what we do with the CERT program, I think that's a perfectly appropriate agenda topic. I don't want that to be a special study session, because remember, in a special study session, you can't make decisions. You can't make motions. You just sit there and you just talk to yourselves.
It was on the committee agenda. It was on the committee agenda, and the committee meeting got, maybe I don't understand, why did the committee meeting get
The committee, I'm not answering that one. The committee not because Manny was sent out on a mission, but because he's been in the USAR coordinating role since Tim Hamill's been gone. So he was up to his eyeballs in getting folks in.
Okay, so but he's still being part of the responsiveness is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Write everything that you want, put on the agenda, please, and send it to Rex and to Harold, and we'll get it as a discussion. So we, you know, whatever your concerns are, I mean.
Okay.
Well, yeah,
Write it up.
may I comment on that? Because once you see the work plan and you see the things that need to get done, to get to the point where you can do some of these things that may mitigate a bit the ability to get that done. That doesn't keep you from talking about it and seeing where it might line up in the future. And you know, the CERT discussion could be both a day-to-day practical one, or it can be a conceptual one about we need to change the whole program, or we need to restructure, and we need to use more volunteers. So, you know, it could be study session, or it could be on a regular agenda, depending a bit on how it's recommended by a board member for discussion. I mean, I'm hearing
let me just
conceptual.
let me not discuss the issue, but just to be clear here, in discussing CERT, that was something that I thought merited a discussion among 5 people without a huge staff report and so forth. That this was a conceptual discussion. I thought we were going to do that because 4 other people might say, let's not bother with CERT. Who cares about CERT? And it's all over with. It's all done. So, but if the best way to do it is to put it on the board agenda, I'll put it on the board agenda. I thought it was something to be done at a planning meeting like we're doing now.
Well, it's an operational responsibility. I don't think that you can, how do we exclude the people who know what's going on from the internal standpoint from the discussion? What kind of discussion do we have about CERT and your perceived lack of responsiveness of the district without having the chief and Manny and Carol and the other people who are involved in the discussion?
So I think that may not be the best example, John, because I agree with Peter. You got to, because it is so operationally based, you have to have some of this evidence. But if you want to talk about pensions or accounts, right? Is that something that is, what does that look like? Where you want to go, if they want to go, whatever, I don't know. Is that something that we want
I
to
think we
take up
could-
in a meeting or a study session? It's just a huge topic. And what does that look like in the future for this? That's a different thing from CERT, it's operationally related to this.
Again, that's only because of that.
No, I
We
know.
could, that's why, because that's what you know. But listen to this, let me just say, we could have a good discussion of CERT. We could get some volunteers in here that talk about how CERT and other organizations is a nonprofit organization within a community entirely run by volunteers like Red Cross or something. And they could tell you that, and you say, oh, that's really interesting. And it wouldn't have to, so I'm just saying, we could have people come in and have, if that were on the agenda, they could talk to you about that.
May I interrupt, Mr. President? I've got to change the videotape. It's a 2-hour tape and we're coming up on it.
Okay.
Unless
So
we're
that's
gonna-
good, well, maybe we can.
Unless we're gonna-
Were we limited to 2 hours? Is that what we were going to do?
We're not limited,
We're
but
not
some of
limited,
us have
but if we're
other,
gonna, if we're gonna
other
videotape the whole
commitments,
thing,
so.
I gotta change the tape, that's all.
No, I'm done. I mean,
Write
I
it
know
out
what
and
it
we'll discuss it. I mean, you know, with the board president and the.
Send me the agenda items, and we'll get on the agenda.
Then I have just
Let's
one,
get those out.
I just have one other quick comment for the thing, a little concern, and that's with goal number 1. I think, I found that wording of it really unfortunate, and part of the group that I need to answer to are the people that voted for me and had certain thoughts, and I can tell you that improving the relationship with employees is not their number 1 goal. And I think it's a mistake to say that. And I think the other wording, building rationality, predictability, accountability, I think that's good. But this is as much for the consistency and stability of the organization as it is for the employees.
Right.
And it's very possible that we could get a contract that they'd be very unhappy with.
So
But nonetheless,
maybe
our
we
goal is to get a
Maybe we
contract.
should call that labor relations and not employee relations. That would be
Or
one thing.
something, I just, yeah.
I would, just one final comment from me, then I'll shut up. But when you come up with suggested ideas, I would really urge that all the board members do that so that the president and the chief are seeing what all of these different requests might be for conceptual discussions. Because part of what you have to do here is plan workload and figure out over a period of time, what are you going to be discussing and acting on. And as it stands right now, when you put into place your capital projects, your administrative projects, that Appendix F with all the standard things you've got to do, like audits and budgets, that makes, and then you can look at that and plug in, once you see what these ideas are, and Director Bernstein had 2 or 3, and you had one or two ideas there. You each had ideas. I would just urge that it not be done just by one board member, if there are others that are get them all on the table, so you know how to schedule that out and talk about it.
I also think that Harold needs an administrative assistant too, other than just a contractual PIO. I think he actually needs to have also. Other public agencies have them. It's got a huge schedule. It's dealing with different cities, different towns, like county, Task Force 3, it's got federal and state agencies dealing with constantly. And a deputy chief isn't going to be around
No, Deputy
for a
Chief
few months.
Operations.
So, and if it has to be someone on a contractual basis to help him with some of the stuff, I think that's reasonable. And I would like that on the agenda, if we as a board have to do
So
something.
send it to
I
Rex.
will, I will, I will.
Send it to Rex.
Well, our work's basically done. You're down
Thank you.
to
Thank you.
Yes,
18
thank you.
hours, and I'm
I'll be at each meeting this week.
I move to adjourn.
We have public comment number 2.
Public comment number
Oh,
2.
Sorry about that.
No public comment number 2.
Nope.
I will
I'll
entertain a
move to
motion.
adjourn.
Second.
Linda's the only member of the.
Those in favor?
I'm getting a t-shirt, I tell you.
Do you
Thank you.
remember that?